Welcome to our world. On March 9, 1953, a nation mourned the loss of its leader, Generalissimo Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin, a figure whose presence loomed over not just the Soviet Union, but the world. For days, Moscow had been gripped by sorrow, as endless lines stretched across the city, leading to the House of the Unions, where Stalin's body lay in state. Funeral music echoed through the streets, and the air was thick with grief. The entire nation seemed frozen in time, hearts heavy with disbelief and loss. Stalin had been loved deeply, genuinely by millions, not through decree or coercion, but because of what he had come to represent: strength, resolve, and the heart of Soviet power. Yet even as his health declined in his final years, many refused to accept that such a towering figure could truly die. Whispers soon spread across the land, rumors that it was not Stalin in the coffin, but a double. This speculation only grew as it became clear that his children, Vasily and Svetlana, were initially barred from viewing the body. Stalin's inner circle, calm and almost indifferent, seemed prepared for his passing, but Vasily, overwhelmed by grief and suspicion, erupted in a fit of hysteria when he finally saw his father. He was murdered. He screamed, unable to accept the death of the man he had known as both father and leader. Thus, Stalin, the driver of the Soviet state, was gone. His death, shrouded in mystery and steeped in intrigue, gave rise to countless theories, both of natural and violent causes. Stalin himself had predicted the turmoil that would follow, once saying, "After my death, a great deal of garbage will be dumped on my grave, but the wind of history will sweep it all away." Now, 7 decades later, the time has come to sift through the myths and lies, to unearth the truth behind the tragic events of early March 1953. The scene was Stalin's dacha in Kuntsevo, March 1, 1953. It was a quiet Sunday, but something was wrong. Stalin did not appear for breakfast or lunch, and by 11 a.m., the security staff became uneasy. They noted movement inside the residence, but still, Stalin had not summoned anyone. A strange silence from a man who had call buttons installed in every room. It wasn't until 10:30 p.m. that a courier from the Kremlin's secret mail service arrived with urgent documents. Accompanied by Pyotr Lozgachev, an assistant to the head of the household, they ventured into Stalin's private quarters. What they found was terrifying: Stalin, slumped awkwardly in the small dining room, unable to speak or move. A copy of Pravda lay discarded nearby, alongside a bottle of mineral water. His right arm, twisted beneath him, told a grim story. The staff quickly moved Stalin to a couch in the larger dining room, the same room where so many late-night Politburo meetings had taken place, and where Stalin had so often pored over documents. They chose this room for its size, hoping the air would help. At 10:40 p.m., the deputy head of security, Star Austin, reported the crisis to the Minister of State Security, Ignatieff. Soon, key members of the Politburo Khrushchev and Bulganin arrived. They questioned the staff but left without checking on Stalin himself. Hours later, at 3:00 a.m., 2 more Politburo members, Beria and Malenkov, entered the scene. In a display of eerie calm, they removed their shoes, approached Stalin, and declared, "Comrade Stalin is resting. Don't disturb him, why are you causing panic?" Their words were chilling, a stark contrast to the urgency of the situation. It wasn't until the following day that a medical team was finally summoned. By then, the damage had been done. Stalin lay stricken by a stroke that had paralyzed half his body, his mind slipping away with each passing hour. The clinical diagnosis, when it came, was grim: hypertensive disease, advanced atherosclerosis of the brain and heart, cerebral hemorrhage, gastrointestinal bleeding, focal pneumonia, and acute cardiovascular failure. It was a catalogue of conditions, all conspiring to bring an end to the man who had once seemed invincible. In the archives of the Russian State Archive of Socio-Political History, the full record of Stalin's final days is preserved. 2 folders, carefully guarded, contain the medical dossier of Joseph Stalin. Inside these documents lies the evidence of his decline, the physical deterioration of a leader who had long been seen as the embodiment of Soviet power. Yet even with all the medical facts, one question lingers: was Stalin's death a natural end, or was there something more sinister at play? The dossier documenting Joseph Stalin's health is a curious mix of both minor ailments and serious conditions that offer a glimpse into the toll taken by his long years of leadership. Stalin's medical records, which mainly chronicle colds, upper respiratory infections, urus, and acute respiratory infections, ARIS, also reveal a more troubling diagnosis: hypertensive disease, which worsened with time and became a recurring theme in his medical history. Arterial hypertension first surfaced in 1944, but signs of heart problems can be traced back as far as 1937, when Stalin was 59, during his brutal campaigns against political opposition. By this time, his risk of stroke was already substantial, compounded by the relentless pressure of his position. His high blood pressure would intensify during the war years, and at 66, the stresses of leadership further eroded his health. By March 1953, Stalin was 74, with heart issues that had plagued him for nearly 2 decades, a situation that made his sudden stroke more foreseeable than many wanted to admit. There is, however, disagreement among historians about the extent of his decline. Some argue that Stalin's physical condition had deteriorated considerably by early 1951, while others point to his active participation in the 19th Party Congress and the 12-minute speech he delivered at its final session as evidence that he was still capable. These contradictions highlight the challenge of reconstructing a full and objective picture of Stalin's health. His medical history was meticulously guarded, and for much of his life, only superficial records of minor illnesses were accessible to historians. The more critical diagnoses, the heart and hypertension issues, remained hidden from public view. One oddity stands out in Stalin's medical history: his electrocardiograms, ECGs. From 1944 until his death, records include an envelope filled with ECG strips from March 2 to 5, 1953, the days immediately following his stroke. But curiously, no ECGs from the preceding 25 years exist in the archives. How could a leader who suffered from hypertension for nearly a decade not have more than a handful of ECGs on file? The only previous ECG dates back to September 9, 1926, and even that is questionable. Stalin's ECG from that year, kept in his medical file, shows no heart abnormalities. However, it lacks the typical markers that would make it a trustworthy document. Cardiologist Oksana Golyubova points out that standard medical protocol requires an ECG to include the patient's full name, age, date, time, and specific technical details like paper speed and voltage, all of which are missing from Stalin's 1926 record. This ambiguity raises further suspicions about the transparency of Stalin's medical documentation. The story of Joseph Stalin's final days and his medical records is fraught with secrecy, manipulation, and suspicion. Historians continue to grapple with the truth, especially given how Stalin's health was deliberately obscured, concealed under pseudonyms like Orlov or Krustalev. This attempt to hide the Soviet leader's true condition further complicates the narrative, making it difficult to ascertain the full extent of his medical struggles in the years leading up to his death. Historian and publicist Ivan Chigidin was among the first to access Stalin's medical archives, uncovering unsettling details. In his book Stalin, Illnesses and Death, Chigidin revealed that Stalin's medical records were not only edited but likely falsified after his death. Pages were renumbered, altered, and even removed, suggesting that those in charge sought to erase or obscure critical information. These manipulations raise questions about what might have been added or taken away, perhaps cardiograms or other significant medical findings. The alterations point to a systematic effort to rewrite the medical history of one of the 20th century's most powerful figures. The possibility that Stalin's medical history was doctored, literally and figuratively, to protect those who treated him cannot be dismissed. By the early 1950s, Stalin had grown deeply distrustful of medical professionals, a suspicion fueled by the infamous doctor's plot. This event cast a dark shadow over Soviet medicine, as numerous doctors, many of whom were highly regarded in their fields, were accused of deliberately misdiagnosing and mistreating top Soviet officials, leading to their deaths. The first alleged victim of this conspiracy was Stalin's trusted confidant, Andrei Zhdanov, whose death in 1948 was later blamed on killer doctors. The doctor's plot quickly evolved into a nationwide anti-Semitic purge, with medical practitioners being labeled as traitors, foreign agents, and part of a broader Jewish conspiracy. Just 2 months before Stalin's death, Soviet citizens were shocked by revelations that a terrorist group of doctors, allegedly recruited by American intelligence and the international Jewish organization Joint, had been caught trying to undermine the Soviet state by harming its leaders. The accusations spread like wildfire, culminating in the infamous Pravda article from January 13, 1953, which stated, "State security agencies uncovered a terrorist group of doctors whose goal was to shorten the lives of active Soviet leaders through harmful medical treatment." Stalin's paranoia had reached unprecedented heights, and it is unclear whether he truly believed in the doctor's plot or whether it was another tactic to reinforce control and purge disloyal elements within the government. The truth is likely somewhere in between. His growing distrust of those around him, particularly doctors, culminated in the arrest of his own physician, academician Vladimir Vinogradov, during the final months of the doctor's plot hysteria. It seems likely that Stalin's fears about his health were exacerbated by these events, leading to an intense isolation in his final years. Stalin's notorious distrust also extended to his inner circle. Longtime secretary Alexander Poskrebyshev was dismissed after being accused of misplacing vital state documents. Similarly, Stalin's personal bodyguard, Nikolai Velasik, was arrested for abuse of power. This culture of fear and purges surrounded Stalin, isolating him from those closest to him, just as his health continued to decline. By March 1953, Stalin's health had reached a critical point, and his paranoia about those around him had spiraled into dangerous territory. His personal physician, Vladimir Vinogradov, had been arrested during the infamous doctor's plot, leaving the highly skilled doctors who were eventually summoned to treat Stalin unfamiliar with his medical history. This situation was nothing short of a tragedy in slow motion. In cases of a stroke, the initial golden hour is crucial, where swift medical intervention can sometimes make the difference between recovery and irreversible damage. Yet, Stalin lay for hours, possibly even half a day, without receiving any help. When the doctors finally arrived, it was clear that the leader of the Soviet Union was already beyond saving. They could do little more than document his rapid decline, a bleak and helpless vigil over a man once feared by millions. Stalin was given oxygen therapy, briefly delaying respiratory failure, but it was clear he was slipping away. Injections of camphor and cardiazol caffeine were administered to boost circulation to his brain and heart. A hypertensive enema with magnesium sulfate was used to lower his blood pressure, and 8 leeches were applied behind his ears in a desperate attempt to thin his blood. This form of leech therapy, or hirudotherapy, was an archaic treatment, far less effective than modern thrombolytic therapies, yet it was all the doctors could do. His final blood tests revealed alarming symptoms: severe intoxication, an enlarged liver, and blood-tinged vomiting. These results later fueled rumors that Stalin had been poisoned, a theory that persists to this day. One of its most ardent supporters is Stalin's great-grandson, Salim Ben Saad, whose personal investigation into his great-grandfather's death has spanned years. Ben Saad's belief in the poisoning theory is rooted in family stories and a deep distrust of the official narrative. According to Ben Saad, attempts on Stalin's life began as early as the 1930s, with 4 poisonings in total. One of the earliest, he claims, involved a woman named Sonia in the late 1930s. Another, more sinister, attempt implicated Stalin's chief cook, Alexander Ignatovsky, who supposedly died from poisoning in 1948, an event Ben Saad firmly believes was no accident. The story of Stalin's final poisoning, according to Ben Saad, centers on the evening of March 1, 1953. That night, Stalin's closest confidants Nikita Khrushchev, Lavrent Beria, Georgy Malenkov, and Nikolai Bulganin visited him at his dacha in Kuntsevo. The 4 men, who would later form the core of the post-Stalin leadership, were all vying for power in the Soviet Union's next phase. Ben Saad suggests that during their conversation, Stalin took a drink without anyone noticing, a drink that would soon prove fatal. Shortly afterward, Stalin collapsed, apparently paralyzed, as if the poison had triggered an immediate and devastating stroke. According to Ben Saad, this was the moment the wheels of power began to shift. There is, however, an alternative version of the events leading up to Stalin's death, one that paints a very different picture. According to one of Stalin's bodyguards stationed at the nearby dacha, Beria, Malenkov and Bulganin were absent on the night in question. Instead, only Nikita Khrushchev visited Stalin, alone. Stalin, by all accounts, never regarded Khrushchev as a serious contender for power. Despite Khrushchev's steady rise within the Soviet hierarchy, Stalin didn't see him as a heavyweight politician. But by 1952, Khrushchev had maneuvered himself into a position of significant influence. Along with Malenkov and Bulganin, he had risen to control the Politburo, making him the second most powerful figure in the Communist Party. Khrushchev, however, wasn't content with being second, he wanted to be first. On the fateful night of March 1, Khrushchev did not arrive empty-handed. He was accompanied by Semyon Ignatiev, the Soviet Union's Minister of State Security, a man whose career hung in the balance. The visit was sparked by an upcoming Presidium meeting on March 2, where Ignatiev's removal from office was to be discussed. Viewed as a weak minister, Ignatiev's future was precarious, especially as Lavrentiy Beria, a rival to Khrushchev, was poised to take control of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. The meeting with Stalin was not casual or celebratory. Instead, it was tense and strictly businesslike. In stark contrast to custom, there was no wine or cognac on the table that night. Only 3 bottles of mineral water were present. Publicist Ivan Chigidin speculated that, at this moment, Khrushchev may have seized an opportunity to poison Stalin rather than engage in a protracted political battle. As the conversation unfolded, Stalin either turned away or briefly left the room, and one of the men, possibly Khrushchev or Ignatiev, allegedly slipped poison into one of the bottles. Adding intrigue to this theory is the account of Stalin's great-grandson, Salim Ben Saad, who claims that, initially, there were only 2 bottles of water on the table. The third bottle, which contained the pre-poisoned Borjomi mineral water, was placed there later. Ben Saad is convinced that the person responsible for the poison had access to secret state laboratories that specialized in developing psychoactive substances and poisons for covert operations. These laboratories were under the control of Beria, Stalin's infamous associate. Lavrentiy Beria, a man deeply entangled in Stalin's regime, was at a critical juncture by early 1953. Once a central figure in Stalin's inner circle overseeing the Soviet atomic project and serving as deputy chairman of the Council of Ministers, Beria's position had become precarious. He was implicated in the Mingrelian affair, a nationalist conspiracy that had led to the arrest of his key allies in Georgia. With his political career hanging by a thread, Beria stood on the brink of ruin, a fate he narrowly avoided only because of Stalin's sudden death. The hypothesis of the poisoned Borjomi bottle gains further weight from a discovery made by Ivan Chigitin in Stalin's archives. Among the documents was a record that detailed the transfer of Stalin's belongings after his death. This record, according to Chigitin, included key information about Beria's activities during Stalin's final days. Could it be that the poisoned bottle was part of a larger, more intricate plot? The document notes that 3 bottles were handed over after Stalin's death, yet the official receipt lists only 2. What became of the 3rd bottle, and why was it never recorded? The most plausible answer is that it contained incriminating evidence, perhaps traces of poison. This missing bottle deepens the mystery surrounding Stalin's final hours and raises one of the most persistent questions: was Stalin poisoned, or did he succumb to a natural stroke? And if he was poisoned, was this even the first attempt on his life? Suspicion doesn't begin with Stalin's final night. His medical records are riddled with unexplained incidents that suggest foul play. After World War II, Stalin began suffering from bouts of unexplained dysentery, despite his food being closely monitored by state security and thoroughly tested in laboratories. One particularly alarming incident occurred in October 1946 when Stalin suddenly experienced severe bloody vomiting and diarrhea. Despite receiving medical attention, his condition deteriorated to a critical state. Beria dispatched his personal doctor, Nikolai Kipshich, who stabilized Stalin. Yet, just a few months later, in February 1947, Stalin once again fell victim to dysentery. These mysterious episodes were noted in the memoirs of General Pavel Sudoplatov, a man well versed in the internal workings of the Soviet Union's political elite. The Stalin who emerged from these health crises was visibly changed. His hair had thinned considerably, his speech, always deliberate, became painfully slow, with long pauses between words. This was not entirely new. Stalin had struggled with digestive issues for decades. By the 1920s, he had already been prescribed a strict diet to manage his gastrointestinal conditions: less alcohol, fatty foods, and spicy dishes, a bland and basic regimen known as Table No. 5. But Stalin, being who he was, rarely adhered to these restrictions. His indulgences could have exacerbated his digestive troubles and played a role in the development of heart disease and hypertension. Hypertension is a known precursor to strokes, and Stalin's medical history makes it plausible that his condition alone could have triggered the stroke that felled him on March 1, 1953. However, another equally plausible theory is that the stroke was triggered by an unknown poison. Such poison could have spiked his blood pressure dramatically, mimicking the effects of his natural condition. A curious detail emerges when considering why Stalin's guards delayed calling for help. When interrogated, one guard gave a chilling response: "It had to be done." The real question is, who wanted it that way? Who orchestrated the delay in treatment, ensuring that Stalin would receive no help in time to save him? Some fingers point directly to Nikita Khrushchev and Lavrent Beria. A year before Stalin's death, in April 1952, Khrushchev and Beria had taken steps to consolidate power. One of the first moves they made was to replace Stalin's loyal bodyguards. Among those removed was Nikolai Vyazovsky, Stalin's head of personal security, who had protected him for 25 years. Vyazovsky once said something eerily prophetic, "Without me, there would be no Stalin." His words proved true, as the new guard staff offered little protection to the man they were assigned to watch. Vyazovsky's removal opened the door for those seeking to control Stalin's fate. Colonel Ivan Khrushchev, newly appointed as the head of Stalin's personal security, was the last person to speak with the dictator on the night of March 1, 1953. By March 5, after Stalin's death, Khrushchev would be known as more than just a silent witness. He would forever be marked as the man who stood by and let Stalin die. The accusations leveled against Khrushchev didn't stop at inaction. Some researchers went as far as to suggest that he had an unsettling fascination with dangerous medications. One of the more bizarre theories claims that Khrushchev poisoned Stalin by soaking the pages of one of his books with dicumarol, a powerful anticoagulant. Stalin, known to wet his fingers while turning pages, may have inadvertently ingested the poison over time. While this scenario could fuel the plot of a thrilling detective novel, it crumbles under historical scrutiny. Like the mysteries surrounding Stalin's death, Khrushchev's own end is shrouded in confusion. Some sources say this once robust, healthy man succumbed to a sudden heart attack just a month after Stalin's death. Others suggest he survived only until Lavrentiy Beria's downfall in December 1953. Yet another version claims that Khrushchev was quietly discharged from service due to his age and passed away in December 1954. Whatever the truth, his connection to Stalin's demise remains enigmatic, forever casting shadows of doubt. But even if Khrushchev had poisoned Stalin, it would have been an extraordinarily risky act. Poisoning Stalin would have required absolute certainty that the conspirator would take his place, whether it be Beria, Malenkov, Bulganin, or someone else. Yet, the reality of post-Stalin politics paints a different picture. Stalin's death did not lead to the rise of a single autocrat, but rather the establishment of a collective leadership, a system designed to prevent any one person from wielding Stalin's immense power. It was in this turbulent power vacuum that Lavrentiy Beria, Stalin's feared secret police chief, launched an aggressive campaign to eliminate his chief rival, Nikita Khrushchev. Beria, notorious for his ruthlessness, personally oversaw the investigation into the circumstances of Stalin's death. Armed with damning findings, he sought to accuse the former Minister of State Security, Semyon Ignatiev, of complicity in Stalin's demise. On June 25, 1953, Beria formally requested permission from the Central Committee to arrest Ignatiev, confident that under pressure, Ignatiev would implicate Khrushchev. But in a stunning reversal of fortune, it was Beria who ended up in prison. On June 26, 1953, he was arrested on charges of plotting a coup and treason against the state. The arrest, trial, and eventual execution of Beria were swift and brutal, with many historians believing it was all a carefully staged performance by Khrushchev and his allies to eliminate their most dangerous opponent. Beria was silenced, and with him, much of the truth about Stalin's final days. The aftermath of Stalin's death was not just a scramble for power, it was an elaborate cover-up, with each player working tirelessly to erase their tracks. Beria, the feared mastermind of Stalin's repressions, became the ultimate scapegoat. It was Khrushchev who orchestrated the purge, ensuring his rival's demise, while positioning himself as Stalin's true successor. Dmitry Pevtsov, who portrayed Stalin in Mark Zakharov's final play, dedicated himself to understanding these intricate political plots. In his research, Pevtsov uncovered the web of backstage machinations that played out in Stalin's Politburo. The evidence pointed to one man, Nikita Khrushchev. It was Khrushchev, the man once underestimated by Stalin, who emerged as the principal architect behind Beria's downfall, orchestrating the political drama that led to his own rise to power. Beria's execution marked a pivotal moment, clearing the path for Nikita Khrushchev's ascension to power, a goal he had long harbored, even during Stalin's reign. Dr. Andrei Malenkov, a distinguished academic and the son of Stalin's close ally, Georgy Malenkov, had crossed paths with Khrushchev many times in his youth. His reflections on Khrushchev reveal a striking duality in the man who would eventually lead the Soviet Union. "I saw Khrushchev, you know, sitting at their table, perhaps in Rostov. He always appeared somewhat simple-minded, and everyone around him seemed to share that impression. But beneath this facade, he was a master of intrigue. He outwitted Beria first, then my father, then Molotov, and finally Zhukov." Indeed, less than 3 years after Stalin's death, at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party in February 1956, Khrushchev would famously denounce Stalin's reign of terror and condemn the political purges in which he had been a complicit actor. Yet, for all his political maneuvering, Khrushchev's legacy is complex. I think the only thing Khrushchev will be remembered for is his attempt to dismantle what Stalin had built, Malenkov asserted. He noted that his generation did not grow up amid the so-called debunking of the personality cult, or the efforts to erase Stalin's name and memory from Soviet history. However, when it came to the question of whether Khrushchev could have murdered Stalin, Malenkov was skeptical unless there was a personal motive. And Khrushchev did indeed have such a motive. During World War II, Khrushchev's eldest son, Leonid, then a military officer, shot a fellow officer in a drunken incident. The law demanded the ultimate penalty, execution. Desperate, Khrushchev pleaded with Stalin to spare his son's life. But Stalin, unmoved, replied, "I cannot change the law." This was a wound that Khrushchev would carry for the rest of his life. Officially, Leonid Khrushchev's sentence was commuted, and he was sent to the front lines as a fighter pilot. The official story holds that Leonid died heroically in an air battle. But no crash site was ever found, and no body recovered. Whispers circulated that Leonid had defected to the Germans, a rumor that haunted Khrushchev for years. The unresolved fate of his son became a source of profound resentment. When Stalin passed away on March 5, 1953, at 9:50 p.m., the news was broadcast to the world. After a serious illness, Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin has died. But Nikita Khrushchev, standing as an honor guard by Stalin's coffin, may have been hiding a secret joy beneath his stoic exterior. Joseph Stalin has passed away, proclaimed the news agencies on March 6, 1953. But was it really Stalin in that coffin? Stalin's own daughter, Svetlana, cast doubt on the scene, famously remarking that the man lying in the coffin didn't look like her father at all. Some speculated it could have been one of Stalin's doubles, men who had been trained to resemble him for security purposes. Could this final act of deception have been orchestrated to veil the truth behind Stalin's mysterious end? Stalin's era was one of unparalleled control, secrecy, and ruthlessness. In such an atmosphere, it's almost unthinkable that anyone would dare approach Comrade Stalin with the audacious proposal, "Comrade Stalin, let's get you a double." His immediate response would likely have been filled with suspicion: "Are my comrades planning to replace me?" In Stalin's world, paranoia wasn't just a trait, it was survival. Yet, despite this climate of fear, the legend of Stalin's doubles persists in historical accounts, finding its way into almost every modern biography of the Soviet leader. The story begins in 1929, when it's said that Stalin's head of security, Nikolai Velasik, took it upon himself to find a double for the increasingly powerful leader. This was not out of vanity, but out of a pressing need to shield Stalin from the constant threat of assassination at public events. The first such stand-in was a man named Rashid, a simple farmer from the North Caucasus, chosen for his striking resemblance to the Soviet leader. Rashid's fate, however, was grim. He is believed to have died in a government motorcade bombing on Red Square in the mid-1930s. By 1937, another double emerged, Yevsey Lubitsky, a bookkeeper from Vinnytsia. Unlike Rashid, Lubitsky's role was more public. He even stood in for Stalin at parades that would last from morning until evening. In such drawn-out affairs, the masses clamored to catch a glimpse of the revered leader, and for brief intervals, Lubitsky became Stalin so convincingly that few, if any, noticed the switch. Despite his success in this role, Lubitsky's fate mirrored that of many who came too close to power in Stalin's Soviet Union. In 1949, he was arrested on charges of discrediting Stalin's image, a vague accusation that signaled his downfall. His disappearance made way for another, unknown double, who would carry the mantle of the Soviet leader until the very end. The intrigue deepens when one considers that there is no official documentation of Stalin's doubles. The Central Archive of the FSB, a treasure trove of Soviet secrets, contains no confirmed records. Some historians, however, offer a chilling theory: by 1951 or 1952, the real Joseph Stalin may have already died, leaving the world none the wiser. According to this hypothesis, it was not Stalin but his double who stood atop the mausoleum during parades, while the true levers of power had passed into the hands of his three deputies from the Council of Ministers, Lavrent Beria, Georgy Malenkov, and Nikolai Bulganin. A decision by the Politburo, announced on February 16, 1951, adds credence to this theory. It granted these three men the unprecedented right to use a rubber stamp with Stalin's facsimile, effectively enabling them to act in his name without the necessity of Stalin's direct involvement. This raises the tantalizing question, to what extent did Stalin voluntarily relinquish his authority? Was this a calculated delegation of power by a leader aware of his advancing age, or had his inner circle quietly sidelined him, recognizing that they no longer needed his presence to make critical decisions? At any moment, Stalin could have been quietly replaced, his immense power becoming increasingly vulnerable as his health declined. The notion that someone else may have taken Stalin's place in his final years is given weight by the recollections of his daughter, Svetlana Alexievna. Her observations reveal a growing distance from the father she once knew. In her memoirs, Svetlana writes, "It's strange, my father doesn't smoke. Strange, his face is red, though he was always pale." The man who had once seemed invincible now appeared foreign, even to his own family. Svetlana had been estranged from her father for months, largely due to his disapproval of her romantic entanglements. Stalin had banned her from visiting his dacha, deepening the emotional chasm between them. Their already fraught relationship only fueled her suspicions when she finally saw him again. The image of Stalin she remembered was gone, replaced by a man who seemed almost like a stranger. Could this have been a result of Stalin's deteriorating health or something far more sinister? As speculation swirls about Stalin's final days, a provocative theory has emerged: the man who died on March 5, 1953, may not have been Stalin at all, but a double. Some believe the real Iosif Vissarionovich Stalin had died earlier, likely in the secluded Bliznaya dacha in Potseva, far from the public eye. The man buried with full honors near the Kremlin wall, hailed as the father of nations, may have been a stand-in, crafted to maintain the illusion of Stalin's iron rule until the very end. Even within his own family, the truth remains a mystery. Stalin's great-grandson, Salimbin Sot, is determined to resolve this lingering doubt by seeking an exhumation of Stalin's remains. For Sot, the answer is simple: take DNA from the grave, and that's it. Yet, the simplicity of his solution belies the layers of intrigue surrounding Stalin's death. For those fascinated by sensationalism and conspiracy theories, it is difficult to accept that such a colossal figure could die in the same way as any ordinary person, succumbing to an illness rather than a grand plot. This disbelief mirrors the ongoing debate about the deaths of other powerful figures in Russian history. Look, some argue, for many decades, if not centuries, people have argued about how Ivan the Terrible died. Was he poisoned or not? How did Boris Godunov die? Was he poisoned or not? It is almost as though such monumental figures cannot simply fade away, their demise must be as dramatic as their lives. The number of theories surrounding Stalin's death continues to grow, and with each new hypothesis, the debate only intensifies. However, amidst all the speculation, the facts remain stubborn. Stalin's medical records point to a cerebral hemorrhage as the cause of death, a common enough end to a life of uncommon influence. But even this conclusion fails to silence the voices that yearn for a more dramatic explanation, as if a man who had shaped an era could not simply die in bed. Ultimately, the legacy of Stalin's death, much like his life, is one of mystery, power, and suspicion. Whether it was truly the real Stalin or his double who passed away on that fateful day will likely remain unresolved, a fitting end to a man whose very existence was shrouded in secrecy and control. Thank you for joining us on Our World. If you found this content valuable, please like, comment, and subscribe.